It's an issue that comes up every presidential election year. Who do you trust to have their finger on the nuclear button? Who do you trust to have the ability to launch nuclear weapons? And the common belief is that the President of the United States, whoever that may be, gives the order and then it happens automatically. This issue has arisen in the 2016 presidential campaign between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton has made a number of statements to the effect that when the president issues the order, it must be complied with, and that as soon as the president issues the order, strategic nuclear weapons are going to be launched within about 4 minutes. Is that actually true? No, actually it isn't. The launch of strategic nuclear weapons is accomplished under the authority of the National Command Authority. What is the National Command Authority? It's the top two people who can release nuclear weapons. In normal circumstances, it is the President and the Secretary of Defense. And the President alone cannot launch nuclear weapons without the concurrence of the Secretary of Defense. That's under normal circumstances. Under normal circumstances, the National Command Authority consists of the President of the U.S. and the Secretary of Defense. It also consists of their designated successors. Now make a note of this. Designated does not mean constitutional successors, because we're only talking about one issue here. We're not talking about succession to the presidency itself, where a person can sign and veto bills. We're only talking about one issue: control of the military, and possibly crisis or emergency control of the military. And that works somewhat differently than presidential succession. The best example, the closest analogy that I can give you is this. If you're familiar with Star Trek, and I'll refer specifically to Star Trek: The Next Generation, you know that the weapon of last resort that all captains have in their arsenal is to enable auto-destruct, to completely destroy the ship. And of course, anyone who would be on the ship would die, so hopefully they've got a chance to evacuate the ship with the emergency escape pods. But if they don't, anybody who's left behind is going to die. And there have been several cases where captains sought to enable auto-destruct over the years, and one was where this entity had decided to learn about death and slaughter the entire crew, and this entity was in complete control, so Captain Picard and Commander Riker agreed to set auto-destruct, enable auto-destruct to blow up the ship. But here's an important aspect. Although the captain is in complete command of the ship, with regard to auto-destruct, he must have the concurrence of at least one other command officer in order to enable auto-destruct. And in the majority of cases, that's going to be under normal circumstances, that's going to be the captain and the first officer. But there are all sorts of circumstances in which one or the other might not be available. There's an established chain of command of succeeding to command of the Enterprise, the commanding officer of the Enterprise. If the Captain Picard isn't available, then Commander Riker, as first officer, is in command of the ship. If neither one of those two is available, then it falls to Commander Data, who is the second officer, then he's in command of the ship. If all three of those are not available, then the next person is Commander LaForge, the chief engineer. He's the fourth person. Then beyond that, you have Dr. Crusher, then you have Counselor Troy, then you have Lieutenant Worf, and so there's this long line of people who succeed to command of the Enterprise whenever it's necessary. And when a person succeeds to the sort of acting captain position, as Riker would normally do, then the second officer, Commander Data, will automatically move up, and then he would be the first officer. So you would have basically Captain Riker and then Commander Data in command, and it's automatic succession. Well, a similar situation exists with the command authority. Under normal circumstances, the National Command Authority is the President and the Secretary of Defense, but there are various situations in which they may not be available. So National Command Authority includes their designated successor. But here's an important point, as I've already mentioned. Designated successor does not mean constitutional successor as President. Now that might seem a little bit complicated, but that's the way it is. Control of the military does not necessarily mean that a person occupies the office of the presidency. And let me explain that a little bit. What happens when a president is still alive but unable to command? There are two ways to deal with that. First, the president himself can submit this declaration to the congressional leadership saying he's unable to perform his duties, and then the vice president becomes acting president. But there's another way, and this would be most likely in the event of disability. The president and a majority of the cabinet submit their paperwork to the congressional leadership stating that the president is unable to perform his duties and that the vice president is assuming the role of acting president. Now that takes time in the best of circumstances. In any case where the vice president and the majority of the cabinet invoke the 25th Amendment, you have a period of time, hopefully it's a short period of time, when nobody is actually in the office of the presidency. Nobody's actually president for a short period of time. Now, this part gets into speculation. This document saying that the vice president and the cabinet are declaring the president unable to do his job and the vice president's taking over, that has to be signed by the vice president and a majority of the cabinet. Speculation. This part is speculation. It's very possible that the vice president has pre-signed documents. Again, I'm only speculating. It could be at the beginning of each term there's this meeting where everybody reaches this consensus that we're going to defer to the vice president on this, and so they all go ahead and sign the documents, and the vice president has those ready to trigger an acting presidency whenever possible. That's only speculation, but it does make sense when you consider that there are all kinds of ways of getting around certain things, such as use of the auto pen. The president can be out of the country and order a bill to be signed with the auto pen. So it's very possible that there is a pre-signed document in the possession of the vice president so that he could assume the presidency. But even then, there's going to be at least a short period of time until that gets transmitted to the congressional leadership. Does this mean that no one is in command, ultimate command of the U.S. military? No, it does not. Because the National Command Authority consists of the President, the Secretary of Defense, and their designated successors. And I want to emphasize, designated does not mean constitutional. So that means, for example, that if a president is not available and the Vice President and the Cabinet have not yet invoked the 25th Amendment, the Vice President is in fact in control of the military. He's not acting President. He can't sign bills or veto legislation just yet, but he can very well control the military. Here's something that has been lost to history a little bit. On 9/11, when George W. Bush was in Florida and he was flying back from Florida and the planes were headed toward, the planes had crashed in New York, and a third one, Flight 93, was headed for the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. Vice President Dick Cheney ordered the military to shoot down Flight 93. He made that decision, and that order was in fact communicated all the way out to the pilots. There was no time to execute that order because the passengers had taken over and Flight 93 went down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. But Vice President Cheney did in fact issue that order. And did he have the authority to do so? Well, yes, because succession in the National Command Authority isn't the same as succession to the presidency, because we're only talking about one issue. We're talking about control of the military as opposed to control of the entire administration. It's an isolated issue. So what I'm saying to you is that there are always people in control of the U.S. military, 24 hours, 7 days a week, no matter what. And the people who are in control of that are the National Command Authority, and anytime one of the principals or both of the principals are not available, there are other people who take over those functions. And it has to be two people. Ordinarily, it's the President and the Secretary of State who would authorize a nuclear strike. But if they are not available, there are other people who move into those functions and can issue nuclear strikes. And that's because succession to command of the military is treated as a separate issue rather than succession to the presidency. And this is very necessary in a time when things can happen very quickly. Now, who are those specific people, and how do they know when it's time to assume the position? That's a secret. That is a secret. And it's a good idea that it's kept a secret. You know, if there's a mixed martial arts fight going on, you don't telegraph to your opponent, I'm throwing a kick now. You don't want everybody to know what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. But this is the point. The normal NCA, the normal National Command Authority, is the President and the Secretary of Defense. If those people, one or both, are not available, there are other people who move into those roles. Now, who they are and how they assume that position, how they know when to do it and how they accomplish it, those things are secrets, because you don't want potential enemies to know everything that you're going to do. But they do have a plan to always have a National Command Authority, which is separate from the presidency. It's separate from signing and vetoing bills. But the point with regard to what's been raised in the Trump-Clinton election, can one person by himself order a launch and see that it's executed? No. It's always two people. It's the two-man rule. It's a technological safeguard that has been in effect for decades. Two people are required to authorize a nuclear strike. Now, is it true that the President could simply fire the Secretary of Defense? Yes, he could. But if you had a person who's acting irrationally, the replacement might not go along with it either. And should it become obvious that, you know, a president is acting irrationally and people are refusing and getting fired, then the Vice President and the Cabinet might have time to invoke the disability clause of the 25th Amendment. That's very possible. Now, that's kind of shaky. There's always a possibility that the President could find somebody as crazy as himself to assume that role, and then they both authorize it. But it is at least a possibility that people might be able to intervene. The Vice President and the Cabinet might be able to intervene. But here's the major point. Two people are always required to launch nuclear strikes, and two people are always available if the principals are not available. Who they are, how they know when to assume the position, and the specifics of how they do it, that part is top secret. That part is confidential. But it's a reality of the world in which we live that you do have to have people in control at all times. You cannot have a time when nobody's ever in control. And so, command of the military is treated as a separate issue than succession to the presidency. And that's how you cover that period of time where there could be nobody in office while the Vice President and the Cabinet are getting ready to act, which is going to take at least a short period of time. So those are the facts with regard to the National Command Authority. It is not true that one person can unilaterally decide to launch nuclear weapons and then, acting completely on his own, accomplish that. The concurrence of at least one other person is required. And who's involved can differ depending on the circumstances, but two people must authorize nuclear strikes. And that's the way it is. So now you know. Have a good day.